I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded message of Presidente Carlos Alvarado Quesada de la República de Costa Rica. Gracias.
Carlos Alvarado Quesada, Republic of Costa Rica. Thank you. Mr. President, Costa Rica congratulates you on your election at the head of the 75th UN General Assembly. We reiterate our commitment to work with you and the Secretary General and with all member states in order to solidify the goals of our session, which are even more pressing at this turning point for all of mankind and for the fate of planet Earth. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought suffering, death, unemployment in one way or another to the entire family of mankind. And however powerful COVID-19 pandemic is, which has led to serious damage to our healthcare systems, our economic and social systems, to our development and our security, the virus seems just to be an early warning. This is an early warning of what mankind is facing now and will face in decades to come. We are just at the beginning of our journey, and as a planet, we must pursue these efforts together, and we must overcome the challenges. Solidarity and multilateralism today take on even greater meaning. Altruism and lofty values must guide us, not because they are the right thing to do, but because both altruism and selfishness converge in the understanding that there can be no individual or national well-being if there is not shared and global well-being. This is the reality of combating COVID-19, addressing migrations to combat illegal trafficking of persons, weapons, or drugs, to combat poverty and to work for development, for human security, for the rights of women, and against the threat of climate change. We must make sure that even the most selfish understand this and that we work together. Skin, hope, roots, tenderness, dinner, silence, bread, home, words. These are the words of our poet de Bravo, which he used to define our most basic desires and needs. But in this statement, at this very privileged place, I do not wish to use rhetoric to grab your attention. I want to bring your attention to Costa Rica's concrete proposals with other partners and the work that we are bringing to this Assembly, and we therefore ask you to give them your consideration, to be involved, and to show support. Since the outset, Costa Rica has insisted that health is a global public good and that the World Health Organization is called upon to lead the multilateral response to the pandemic. On the 29th of May, Costa Rica, the WHO, and 40 states launched a platform to exchange information, know-how, and intellectual property so that testing, treatment, and technologies to combat COVID-19 would be accessible for everyone, anywhere in the world. Costa Rica believes that vaccines must be given first and foremost to the most vulnerable, such as the elderly, people at risk, to women and to girls, to indigenous peoples, and to Afro-descendant persons, to people deprived of their freedom, and of course, to the healthcare workers and staff who are working on the front line in responding to the pandemic worldwide. Participation in this proposed platform for exchange is voluntary, but I invite all states to join it. For our part, we have brought to this platform equine plasma treatment developed at the Cloromiro Picado Institute in the University of Costa Rica. This is an innovative development in antiviral plasma to make it possible to combat the virus in its early stages and to help keep people from needing treatment in intensive care. A second proposal put forward by Costa Rica is the COVID-19 Relief Fund, or FACE, as it's known in English. FACE will be a special relief fund of $500 billion financed with 0.7% of the GDP of the largest and strongest economies of the world, those that represent 80% of the global GDP. And this fund would be brokered by one or several multilateral development banks by providing concessional loans to developing countries. These funds would be provided through long-term loans at fixed rates. This figure is modest if you compare it with the amounts which high-income countries have set aside to address the domestic fallout of dealing with COVID-19, either by increasing monetary flows, fiscal deficits, supporting businesses and workers, or attending to their own public debt. This amount is equivalent to more than 3% of the average GDP of emerging and poor economies, such as our own. To act in this way, to act decisively through innovation and through organization, is the only way we can keep our countries from experiencing economic destabilization and seeing a destabilization in the global financial system. This is the only way we will be sure to leave no one behind. The purpose of FACE is to protect every country and to protect the global community. Ladies and gentlemen of the global community, if we have learned anything from this pandemic, it is that we cannot speak about security without speaking about human security, and yet global military spending continues to rise and has reached the absurd figure of $1.9 trillion in 2019. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, an increase in military spending in 2019 was the greatest annual increase over the past decade and the highest level since the end of the Cold War. The International Peace Office calculates that with the cost of one war tank, 26,000 persons could be treated for malaria, and that with the cost of a single airplane carrier, we could reforest an area larger than the state of Florida in the United States. That's equivalent in size to Switzerland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium combined. If at least a fraction of these resources were used to combat the pandemic as well as address climate change, our generation could say proudly that we were able to redefine our priorities when circumstances warranted it. These priorities, which the permanent members of the Security Council, who in turn are the greatest arms producers in the world, should help to redirect in light of Article 26 of the Charter. The Security Council should change its name and become the Human Security Council. Our resources and our priorities must focus on the most ambitious and comprehensive human development program ever designed, Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. These goals today are more relevant than ever. We have this model to overcome the crisis and to prepare us to meet future crises. Fairer, more equitable and sustainable societies will be more resilient to inequalities which this pandemic has revealed and magnified. Today, prioritizing these efforts means fewer weapons, less resources for development, more resources for development, more resources to combat the pandemic, more resources to forestall climate change, more resources for the SDGs, and less militarization and death. This is genuine human security for all peoples. Reform in our collective security architecture can no longer be deferred. This means that the primary body entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security must be more democratic, representative, responsible, and transparent. A council which delves into the deep-rooted causes of conflicts and not just the symptoms. A human security council which creates incentives to transfer human and economic resources worldwide towards development and peace, and not towards the war machine. A council capable of overcoming its deep-rooted internal divisions and to work together and speak in a single voice. Costa Rica supports the Code of Conduct for Security Council's action in the cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes that would convene a General Assembly to address an issue whenever there is a veto in the Security Council. Impunity is not acceptable. Renewed commitment to multilateralism means that we must ensure that those who are responsible for violations and for flagrant abuse of human rights be held accountable for their actions. Costa Rica reiterates its firm commitment to the purposes and principles enshrined in the Rome Statute and calls for its universal ratification, as well as to preserve the integrity and the independence of the International Criminal Court. Of course, some major changes are needed in the face of any unilateral sanction against its institutionalism or its staff. These acts are considered an affront to multilateralism. Renewed commitment to multilateralism means respecting the UN Charter and international law without exception. Selective approaches also weaken our collective security system. These approaches have meant that the nuclear weapons states have disregarded or threatened to disregard the obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and yet they demand others abide by these obligations. I invite all states who have not yet done so to sign and ratify this historic agreement. In this regard, Costa Rica calls for a Korean peninsula which is free of nuclear weapons, with peace, stability, and security. And we therefore call upon the DPRK to respect and apply Security Council resolutions in this area. Costa Rica calls for a fair solution to the Palestinian issue. Parties must resume their peace talks because we are convinced the only solution to the conflict will be the creation of two states on the basis of relevant Security Council resolutions, so that these states can coexist side by side in democracy, justice, and in peace. Moreover, we welcome the agreements between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. In our America, we would draw attention to the economic embargo against Cuba, which impacts its population. This situation must end. We also believe that a peaceful, speedy, and democratic solution should come from the region, from the Venezuelans themselves, in response to this serious political, humanitarian situation and the violation of human rights they are experiencing. Costa Rica shares the concerns expressed by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, in her recent report to the Human Rights Council on the situation in Nicaragua. We strongly urge the government of this brotherly country to address the structural problems and tensions constructively and to be guided by respecting human rights and the well-being of their citizens. Guaranteeing respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms is the only path which will lead to peace, inclusion, and development. The tragedy in Haiti calls for joint action. There are entire groups of Haitian men, women, girls, and boys who are seeking better conditions elsewhere in the Americas, and it is time for us together to help resolve this serious humanitarian situation. A number of violations of international law are committed day after day through misinformation, cyber attacks, cybercrime, and interference in electoral processes. Costa Rica therefore welcomes General Assembly resolutions which call upon all member states to be guided by the reports of governmental groups of experts which confirm the applicability of current international law, including the Charter as a whole. But the international community must still provide greater guarantees to individuals and to institutions. Mr. President, if COVID is a early warning sign for mankind, the climate crisis and inequality are the greatest threats to human security for our generation and the future generation. We must embrace the complex tasks and not run away from them. Reason, empathy, science, brotherhood, speaking the truth, however hard that is, must win out over simplistic hate speech or polarizing speech, which in their simplicity and superficiality block progress and dampen the human spirit. This complex task means that we must ensure the implementation of the most relevant sustainable development instruments, namely Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and the Sendai Pathway. We also must have a safe fiscal space. There must be debt relief. There must be official development aid and international cooperation in order to bridge the gap between the development objectives and our necessary action. We cannot speak about sustainability if we do not take the necessary actions to ensure effective protection of the ocean and its biodiversity. For that reason, Costa Rica is participating actively in negotiations on a new agreement to protect biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction and in negotiations on the mining code regulations, which are being carried out within the International Seabed Authority. We are raising our voice so that no mining contract will be considered unless we can guarantee protection and effective preservation of the marine environment. As well, along with France, we are promoting a highly ambitious coalition to ensure that 30% of land and maritime areas of our planet will be protected by 2030. This is a solution based on nature in our efforts to combat the climate crisis. Any pandemic which has affected mankind throughout our history has come and gone. But the question is, how well will we tackle our pandemic and how will we come through it? We will overcome this crisis, but how do we want to start over? In starting over, we must build inclusive, sustainable, carbon-free economies that respect human rights. Mr. President, Costa Rica renews its commitment to multilateralism focused on the dignity of persons, in particular the most vulnerable. Agile and action-oriented multilateralism, we believe, is necessary, and international security, national security, and human security in this context are not polar opposites. They go hand in hand. Multilateralism, through an entrepreneurial and resilient spirit to promote inclusive and sustainable economies. As we commemorate this anniversary, Costa Rica renews its commitment with hope that we will continue our mission even in the most adverse conditions, and we hope that the United Nations organization will carry out its duty for which it was established, its duty to all of mankind, and that it will foster peace, not with words, but through action. And I hope that at the end of this chapter, the world will be able to say, as our poet said, I have returned to my country. That is, that part of me that was far away, lost in the fog of not knowing, not believing. I have returned. Today I see those people who crowd the streets, the squares, the parks, done up in their usual dress. I see people tying their shoes early in the morning as if they were attaching the weight of the world. And in all of them, I see a light, which is not just the reflection of the red taxis or the sound of the newspaper hitting the door like a gunshot, or the flash of the ticket we show on the train, which indicates that we've only paid for the kilometers we are traveling that day. I see the light of another time, our time. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Costa Rica for the statement just made. I now